You're listening to KSG Podcast. This is a short, crisp, concise, exam-oriented, edited editorial for civil services aspirants. In this podcast, we are going to talk about the new climate report. Source for the content is Ahmedabad's article for the Indian Express. The latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is IPCC, released in February 2022, has warned of multiple climate change-induced disasters in the next 2 decades, even if strong action is taken to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. It has said the ability of human beings and natural systems to cope with the changing climate was already being tested, and further rise in global warming would make it even more difficult to adapt. Noting that over 3.5 billion people, over 45% of the global population, were living in areas highly vulnerable to climate change, the report identifies India as one of the vulnerable hotspots, with several regions and important cities facing very high risk of climate disasters such as flooding, sea level rise, and heat waves. Now, talking about the IPCC report, the latest warnings have come in the second part of IPCC's sixth assessment report, which talks about climate change impacts, risks and vulnerabilities, and adaptation options. The first part of the report was released in August last year. That one was centered on the scientific basis of climate change. The third and the final part of the report, which will look into the possibilities of reducing emissions, is expected to come out in April. The assessment reports, the first of which had come out in 1990, are the most comprehensive evaluations of the state of the Earth's climate. Hundreds of experts go through every available piece of relevant published scientific information to prepare a common understanding of the changing climate. The four subsequent assessment reports, each thousands of pages long, came out in 1995, 2001, 2007, and 2015. These have formed the basis of the global response to climate change. The sixth assessment report does not say anything remarkably new. Over the years, each assessment report has built on the work of the previous ones, adding more evidence, information, and data so that most of the conclusions about climate change and its impacts have far greater clarity, certainty, and wealth of new evidence now than earlier. But that does not mean this is only a reiteration of previous statements. Each of these reports have also progressively expanded the scope of the assessment and introduced fresh information about different aspects of climate change. The latest report has, for the first time, made an assessment of regional and sectoral impacts of climate change. It has included risks to and vulnerabilities of megacities around the world. For example, it has said that Mumbai is at high risk of sea level rise and flooding, while Ahmedabad faces serious danger of heat waves. Such granular information was not available in previous assessment reports. Flooding in Mumbai and heat waves in Ahmedabad are common occurrences. What this report has done is to look at granular data affecting these events and quantify these risks so that there is a much clearer understanding of the threats posed to these cities. Also, for the first time, the IPCC report has looked at the health impacts of climate change. It has found that climate change is increasing vector-borne and waterborne diseases such as malaria or dengue, particularly in subtropical regions of Asia. It has also said that deaths related to circulatory, respiratory, diabetic, and infectious diseases, as well as infant mortality, are likely to increase with a rise in temperature. Increasing frequency of extreme weather events like heat waves, flooding, and drought, and even air pollution was contributing to undernutrition, allergic diseases, and even mental disorders. Talking about the other findings, the report has said the impacts of climate change were far greater, more frequent, and vastly more disruptive than previously understood. Based on increased observations and a better understanding of processes, we now know that the extent and magnitude of climate change impacts on nature are greater than previously assessed. The report says that based on increased observations and a better understanding of processes, we now know that the extent and magnitude of climate change impacts on nature are greater than previously assessed. The impacts we see today are appearing much more faster, they are more disruptive and more widespread than we expected 20 years ago. The report has said that while strong actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the near term, in the next 20 years, would substantially reduce the threats and the projected damages, they would not eliminate them all. If the temperature rise crossed the threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial times, then many changes could be irreversible. The need to take adaptation measures is therefore very important, the report has stressed. It has recognized progress being made to adapt to the new situation, but pointed out that in most places it was nowhere close to what is required to be done. It has said that the gaps in adaptation were a result of lack of funds and political commitment, and also the absence of reliable information and a sense of urgency. It has pointed out that there were feasible and effective adaptation options which could reduce the risks to people and nature. But the effectiveness of these options decreased sharply with further increases in temperature. The report further says that adaptation is essential to reduce harm, but if it is to be effective, it must go hand in hand with ambitious reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, because with increased warming, the effectiveness of many adaptation options declines. So that's it for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. To join KSG India courses and to crack the ICE exam, visit ksgindia.com. You can also get a PDF of this podcast on ksgindia.com. Thanks for listening.